if you feel the urge during it to say terrible, awful things.
Okay, you'll be cool.
Someone might hear you. I'm just saying.
Not very much. What have I been up to today? Wow, very little.
Yeah,
Like 2 days. Yeah.
nice.
I just started my PhD again. So yesterday I went to the office for 2 hours and then I just came to come. Yeah. How's your flat? Unloading, I think, going.
Oh, grim. I love this. Yeah, I just had food with it. But I also love all my stuff. So everyone's like, oh yeah, great time to cull. And I'm like, no, I want to.
Do you think that's okay?
Yeah. At least for next year. And then I'll go from there. Yeah. Well, no, actually, apparently now they think it wasn't that. They think it was something else, and it's supposedly been fixed. But
Okay.
I haven't been asked.
Okay, that's promising.
Yeah, apparently it was a coffee shop next door just opened, and they were going to fit back on a night. So they didn't think it was sewage, but it was a waste packing area.
Okay, that old
And
coffee.
had been knocked out.
Ooh, that's really horrible.
Yeah, and it continuously just
I remember how bad you feel like you have been rotting and leaking all over.
also how bad you feel.
They're in the literal greenhouse.
It is a very clean.
Oh, yeah.
This is the nicest location for
Yeah, it's really cool.
Great. I don't know. I'm worried now. Yeah. I only bought one. So I need to sell that.
You can always sell them all. They're not very expensive.
I am test. Hello. God, that's ooh. Is that? Yeah, no, that's fine. Hi all, welcome to Lighthouse and welcome to the launch of This Dark Country. Very exciting. So basically how this is going to work is I'm going to introduce Becky. Surprise, surprise, she's right here. And then she's going to read for a little while. And then I'm going to do some Q&A stuff. And then there will be an opportunity for audience questions. So feel free to prepare those at any point, you know, get out a notebook, really think hard. That's all fine. So without much further ado, get out my official piece of paper. Rebecca Birrell was born in Liverpool in 1991. She studied English literature at UCL, then women's studies at the University of Oxford. She has occupied curatorial positions at the Jewish Museum London, the Department of Prints and Drawing at the British Museum, and at the Charleston Trust. In 2018, she undertook a fellowship at the Yale Centre for British Art. While finishing her PhD at the Edinburgh College of Art, She worked on the photographic archive at the Wilhelmina Barnes Graham Trust. She likes to multitask, apparently. She is currently assistant keeper of paintings, drawings, and prints at the Fitzwilliam Museum, University of Cambridge. This Dark Country is her first book. It is illuminating and necessary and really, really brilliant, and it won't be her last. So please join me in welcoming Becky Farrell. Thank you, Rosa. You're so welcome. Okay, let's hope I'm talking into the microphone for the whole time. Am I? Yes. Yeah, okay. Just let me know if you can't hear me. I'm going to read a short section from my book. I think it needs no introduction, hopefully. So here we go. What survives of Edna War? Sketches of sailing ships on cream paper covered in dark stains, the look of wrecks pulled from the sea, anatomy drawings and sweeps of charcoal, legs materializing and striding across the page, modeling motion and strength, roughly executed ideas for larger compositions, drawings judged sufficient experiments in themselves, street scenes with figures, diaristic accounts of a passage through the city, a small bouquet of wildflowers left between the sheets, besides which a man closes his eyes, neck reaching back as though catching their scent, a sunset in stewed peach watercolor with an indigo blue that pours in from the margins, and if it isn't water or wind or the coming darkness, then what is it? A single black feather, a talisman. Edna sets her pencil down and the line falters. Flower studies around smudges of colored chalk like loosened earth. A woman leaning into a sketchbook, a woman reading at a window, a woman walking against the wind, a woman waiting by a door, a woman underneath a portrait of another woman, a woman. What survives of Edna War is a cautionary tale of how a disastrous marriage jeopardized a woman's immense talents, so much so that it meant she narrowly missed having any work to be remembered by at all. Judged proficient enough to enter the Slade at the age of 14, Edna went on to win the school's most significant prizes. She had met her husband the year before. Twice her age, William Clark Hall was a barrister specializing in the rights of children. These professional concerns did not cohere with the troubling desires that animated his life outside of court. William has been described as enchanted by the then 13-year-old Edna, a remark that fails to account for the extremely unsettling power differential that structured their relationship from its start, but might perhaps refer, in its romanticism and willful naivety, to how William's fixation on Edna drew its emotional repertoire from the Victorian cult of the child. For adults like William, emerging from the 19th century, childhood was an exalted state of purity to be preserved and prolonged. But for men seizing upon these qualities in girls, there was an additional, darker motivation. A girl who remained young forever retained her innocence, her inexperience, and ensured she had no desires, no will of her own, no power, no ambition, no talents that might threaten his own, all of which prepared her well to become a wife. Even Henry Tonks, famous for his hypercritical approach to teaching at the Slade, and who is known to be dismissive of women artists, urged Edna to think of her career, warning her that marriage would prove disastrous. Her friend Ida Nettleship agreed, insisting to Edna that her fate as an artist was already sealed, and so much had already been overcome in arriving at the Slade that whether or not she loved William was irrelevant. She must not marry, at least not yet. Edna did not heed this advice, but neither did Ida, who soon married the painter Augustus John, the charismatic brother of her friend Gwen, a fatal misstep. I hope for a different life later on, Ida had confided to Gwen in August 1904, already solely burdened with the care of their 3 children, Augustus having lost interest in the pursuit of another lover, and a few years before she died alone, giving birth to their 5th child at 30. Edna eventually accepted William's proposal. A watercolor still life of her wedding breakfast shows the plenty and possibility Edna imagined entering into through marriage, bowls heaped with jewel-colored fruits, their color spreading beyond their bounds with an infectious brightness. But as a prediction, the work would prove unsound. William would go on to ruin Edna's career, and you might even say her life. Edna's later assessment of the aftermath was lucid. I was put on a pedestal and forgotten. If William could not have a girl as a wife, then what he wanted was a housekeeper, a woman willing to manage his affairs, direct the servants and appear by his side at parties, and a woman eager to give herself over to those concerns alone. William asked Edna to remove her paintings and drawings from the walls of the house. She obliged, hiding her materials too. She waited each morning for the slammed door, the sudden quiet. Once sure of his departure, she began working in secret. I think it would be nicer for her to do other things, Gwen John wrote to her friend Ursula, politeness tempering her alarm on hearing that Edna was unwell, unhappy, and having another baby. What survives of Edna Wharton are the scores of watercolours produced for her project on Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights. Loose and impassioned and full of transfigured anger, they would define the 2 decades that followed. In the novel, Edna found a framework through which to understand her own longing and frustration, in placing the narratives of grief alongside one another, their agonizing present pressed against the heightened fictional world. She could attach her suffering to a story larger than her own experience. She began illustrating the novel, and all the untapped intensities from her romantic life were transferred into a simulation of love over which she had total control. In the absence of models, Edna used herself as the basis for Cathy and Heathcliff. One recent historian claims that in modeling for Heathcliff herself, there is a lack of strength and conviction in Edna's depiction of men, but he misses the point. Edna extracted the idea of a passionate, devoted man out of her loneliness, and it shows. Naturally, the fantasy lacked conviction. It had no precedent in Edna's life to work from. She was already accustomed to playing the part of both lovers, attending to her own needs in response to her husband's neglect. Why not use that experience of self-sufficiency in her art? Edna discovered more compelling than the realities of men were her own capacities for the erotic, which she was not afraid to use in the manner that the poet Audre Lorde insists women should, as a form of knowledge. For Edna, the erotic was an instinctual response that became a resource from which to explore fictional characters. And from these studies of anatomy and psyche, it became a more comprehensive project, a means of mapping out an alternative version of heteromasculinity, one with its own power and principles, molded by and through the interests of women. Racked with loneliness made worse by the atrocities of the First World War, Edna suffered a nervous breakdown in 1919. Omens in her sketchbook, a drawing of a woman's face which disintegrates below the eye, the rest of her features a succession of wavering lines. Neat plaited hair, those basic appearances maintained, her mouth gone altogether, her voice stoppered. The drawing communicates a total collapse of self, a crisis well known to Edna. Only under duress did her husband give her a studio. One of the many sketches of women amongst Edna's papers has her subject in a billowing smock, entirely absorbed, her hand moving across a sheet of paper. For centuries on canvas, women's hands were folded obediently in their laps, or women's hands were ineffectually guarding themselves from an oncoming assault, or women's hands were gesturing the eye to the most valuable parts of their bodies. Edna was gathering the means to retaliate against these tropes. Over the next few pages, Edna crops the composition until it is simply the hand with charcoal balanced between its fingers, and it is an active hand, insisting upon its ability to impress itself upon and remake the given world. And she draws it repeatedly as she chases the precise shape of that labor. Accuracy was as desirable as it was for any artist, and for Edna, the repetition of this charged, embodied fragment allowed her to not only perfect its look, but also to explore all the determination, willfulness, and refusal art made under patriarchy necessarily involved. For artists like Edna, so much of the body would undergo a similar treatment, a reformulation informed by ceaseless empirical study. Limbs redrawn, adjusted, practiced, reconstructed again and again, then scrapped, the old associations resisted with every mark made. Edna lived to be 100. Those hands were multiplying themselves over a sheet of paper in some drawer long after her husband died, and perhaps it was their promise, a kind of radiation that filled the house pervasively and soundlessly and forever, which sustained her. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Yes, you may remove your glasses.
Thank you.
I've never read from it for so long before. But you did remarkably
so many words.
Yeah, you wrote quite a few of them. So obviously that is your section on Edna Wharton. Do you want to start off by kind of telling anyone who doesn't know the sort of the premise of the book, the basic premise? Yeah, so the basic premise of the book is, well, I began with a set of particular artists. So Vanessa Bell, Carrington, Gwen John, Nina Hamnet, Ethel Sands and Gluck. And it's about their still life paintings and how those still life paintings kind of embodied a sort of queer possibility that can be read through their lives. But in the process of researching that set of artists, I encountered these other women in the archives. Edna Wharton is one of them, who have left almost no trace really in history, and whose stories I also kind of wanted to tell. And because someone like Edna Wharton, for instance, has this incredible archive at the Tate, but there's just very little work that's actually on her, because her life was really very much curtailed by patriarchy, basically. It's a classic story. Yeah. One of the kind of key stylistic parts of the book is the fact that you always refer to these artists by either their first name or their chosen name. What was kind of behind that stylistic choice?
So I think that the argument against using first names often centers around this idea of seriousness. So, it's like, why not give the women the same seriousness that you give to men who in biographical studies or academic studies often go by their surname? Why this kind of chatty over familiarity? But I think that the book in general as a project is trying to challenge these ideas about seriousness. Indeed, still life itself was considered to be an unserious, trivial, feminine genre. So there's that. There's also, I think, surnames, they're about identification, but they're also about possession and inheritance. You might say that historically, surnames were there to brand women and to control them, to lay claim to their identities and their capacities for reproduction, and to connect men across time through a particular name. So all of that, to put it mildly, not really what my project was about. And then on a very practical level, I think that I realized that, for instance, Carrington and Gluck went by either their surnames or a version of their surname. And I realized that if I had everyone by their surname, the kind of radical nature of that gesture for them would sort of be lost, I think. So as you can tell, I thought about this a lot. And at the beginning, I was using surnames, but then by the end, I changed. So,
oh, that's interesting. Did you find then that once you switched them over, that something kind of fundamentally shifted in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was more just I knew by that point what the book was trying to do. And I think that because I began writing the book at the same time that I began doing my PhD, and in my PhD everything was surnames. And I think that as I moved through my PhD, and I wanted to sort of challenge the kind of objectivity and distance that the PhD demands that you have with your subjects. So yeah, that was why it changed. Partly my frustration with academia.
It makes complete sense. It fuels so many things in my life. So throughout the book, you kind of balance art criticism and biography. But much of your kind of, I suppose, critical acuity is actually directed at archival materials rather than sort of finished pieces of art. What kind of lay behind that decision?
I think that lay behind the fact that I began my career as an art historian, such that I am one of those.
You are.
Working in an archive at the Charleston Trust, which I was working on this enormous archive, over 7,000 pieces of work, which was uncatalogued material by Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. So it was kind of sketchbooks, notebooks, ephemera. And this material just really fascinated me. I think there was something about its private address that was quite amazing and spooky, but also because you could see, for instance, someone like Vanessa working through particular ideas and concepts in this very kind of nascent form, and then they would resurface in her work in really strange, peculiar ways. But also I think because when you're looking at notebooks and sketchbooks, you're able to kind of experience with the artist their kind of feelings and thoughts as well, I think. And even if it's very oblique, I think it can be quite striking. So in a kind of average sketchbook, say you have a kind of shopping list and a picture of a baby and a picture of Duncan Grant, her like friend and lover, and then you have a kind of landscape drawing. And the way those things interacted really fascinated me. Like they're telegraphing something, but what is it exactly? And so it was there really that I began to be much more interested in the kind of the sketch rather than the finished work, and the sort of kernel of something else, something kind of in excess of the kind of finished thing.
Well, and that really, I suppose, then chimes with these same kind of methodological ways in which you're going about, thinking about how to talk about these artists, how to, it's kind of, it's subversive in another way to talk about the unfinished piece.
And it's minor. I think I'm just interested in minor things, in the minor genre of still life, and in the minor form that is the kind of unfinished drawing and minor artists. I like minor.
So talk to me about your days in the archive. What did those days look like? The process of researching this book, which is so kind of, it's so present in the book itself. Do you want to just chat us through your days?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting about doing archival research is that I didn't, even though I'd worked in an archive, I didn't really know how to do archival research before I began doing it. I think I expected it to be much more straightforward, a sort of transfer of knowledge, that I would go there and I would open a box and it would be the letters all in a very neat row that would tell me something very coherent about the identity of the person that I was looking at. But in fact, because of the fact that most of the artists that I was looking at were queer, there's often all these kind of evasive, kind of playful, slippery, self-conscious strangeness in all of the archival material that I looked at. And so I think that often when I was actually in the archive, it would be a much more, I would be stopping and starting constantly. I mean, in the case of, for instance, Ethel Sands, who's the second big chapter in the book, when I got to the archive and got all of this material out, boxes and boxes of it, I realized very quickly that I couldn't read any of it. It was written in such a way for privacy, so it was totally unreadable. And I'd taken I'd taken a week off work to go to London to do it, and I just I couldn't read any of it. And so it was actually then that was when I found Edna Wall, because I realized I just couldn't do anything with this material. And so I just was sort of meandering through the archive database. So not very methodical. I like to think of it as deliberately intuitive. But I think that you have to allow yourself to be surprised by what is there, which I didn't anticipate, actually.
And quite often in the book, you have this sort of emergence of the self. You know, you'll be writing in this quite broad third person, and then there'll be this I that sort of appears. Kind of, it always felt to me like out of the gloom, like out of the darkness, there would be Becky, hi, like it was, and obviously I know you, so there's a slightly different relationship there, but I think anyone reading this book would feel that the I kind of comes forward at a very particular and opportune moments. What was that about for you as a kind of writing style?
Well, I think that it is born out of the fact that when this book was first coming into being, when it was a proposal, I had the idea that the book would be much more personal. I thought that it would be much more I thought there would be kind of 50% I, 50% everything else. But as I began writing it, I had two experiences. One was just realizing there was just so much material available that it seemed like, why would anyone care about me? It just seemed so much more interesting to foreground and bring to the surface these women's lives. And the other experience is that I think that there is a lot of work at the moment that's kind of cultural criticism that has a kind of I in it, and some of it is more successful than others. And I think that I just thought, maybe that's not for me. And so I think that what remains, the kind of I that emerges from the gloom, as you so poetically put it, I think I wanted to keep myself there for reasons that I've already sort of stated, because I don't like this idea about objectivity and distance. I think when you research something, you do become obsessed with it. And I think that there are ways in which myself, my interests, my desires, my feelings about things shape the book, even without me putting I before every single clause, which was something that I actually figured out through the editorial process. That my editor said, you don't need to begin a sentence by saying I in order for people to know that this is your very personal interpretation of something, because often the interpretive work that I do is quite wacky. So it's not exactly the word I would use,
but close.
Yeah.
But there is this very particular kind of interpretive method that definitely strays from kind of very strict art criticism. And there's a clear way in which that's, as you've already said, kind of subversive or kind of anti-patriarchal or anti-establishment. Did you also feel that was a kind of natural way for you to write, to kind of respond in that personal way, as opposed to trying to summon a degree of objectivity?
Yeah, I think it's also has something to do with my frustrations with the discipline of art history as well, where there is so much emphasis on intention rather than interpretation. And I'm from an English background where you can do lots of interpretation, I think.
Death of the author, baby.
Exactly. So, and I think it's also a kind of frustration from working in museums where often I would see in my life labels, or I would be forced to produce labels that would just state the incredibly obvious. So you would sort of see a painting by Vanessa Bell of like haystacks or something, and the label would say, this is a painting of haystacks by Vanessa Bell, you know? And it frustrated me because I think there's so much more that you can say that isn't just a paraphrase or description, that you can create new meaning and draw out these kind of alternative resonances from it. And that isn't you authoritatively stating what this work means or what it is about. I think it's just learning to be attentive to the kind of alternative vibrations an artwork might have.
I think that curatorial stance really does come out. Like, it's so clear that that's where a lot of your training comes, because you have, I would say, not an obsession, but an interest in the label, the gallery label.
Yes.
And at one point, you know, for example, you use it as a way into talking about class and the relationship between sort of class and domesticity. And you say that on all of Vanessa Bell's paintings, there should be a list of all of her female servants. Would you talk a little bit about what your sense of, because what that kind of implies is that these women were actually essentially collaborators in this work. Could you talk a bit about your sense of collaboration, you know, and these ideas of class?
So I think that basically, I think that this idea of the heroic male artist persists in interesting ways in how we think about female artists. So the classic idea of the heroic male artist is this sort of autonomous figure that is just a genius in a complete vacuum and creates this work just purely from the brilliance of his own thoughts. And I think in an attempt to kind of recover women artists from obscurity, some of these ideas have been reproduced. And it was something I noticed in particular with Vanessa Bell, I think simply because I was working in an institution that was about Vanessa Bell, the Charleston Trust, where there was often this kind of fawning amazement at how she managed to produce all of this work. And she was incredibly prolific, but no one ever mentioned the fact that she just had loads and loads of free time because she didn't have a job and had domestic servants doing all of her work for her entire life. And I just think that it doesn't help anyone to suggest that women are kind of geniuses that are not affected by their social context or whatever. And I really wanted to think about in the book to sort of think about this idea of collaboration a bit more, because even for instance with Gluck, something that really interested me was the fact that her most famous paintings are of these incredibly clean, spare, brilliant flower scenes that are just very, very clean. They look so clean. And it just fascinated me that this effect was something that was created by other people, not by Gluck. This aesthetic was a kind of aesthetic of being waited upon. But again, that's something that will probably never be recognized in a label of one of his works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was so striking. It was something that I probably hadn't really given any kind of proper consideration to. But you describe the way in which there are sorts of scenes of domesticity that you would perhaps read naturally through a kind of gendered perspective. Oh, it's a woman artist and she's painting this kind of, you know, domestic scene, without thinking about the fact that actually maybe it's not her labor that's on show, because she's busy painting. She's wildly wealthy.
Yeah, totally, exactly.
So again, on the labels point, yes. I wondered if, I mean, you talk again at one point about, I get the impression that your greatest desire in some ways is to rewrite just about every gallery label in the country, maybe, and beyond. And your chapter on Gwen John obviously looks a lot at her relationship with Auguste Rodin, and you actually write an alternative gallery label for one of his pieces of art that centers her. And I wondered if you could talk about that idea of the relationship between the artist and the so-called muse, and the way in which women are so often figured as a muse rather than as an artist in their own right.
Yeah, I mean, rewriting that label comes out of years of frustration in supposedly serious galleries Gwen John's work. Even very recently, I went to the Ashmolean in Oxford, and the label about Gwen John's painting was about Rodin. I mean, it's just incredible. And yeah, I think that these ideas about the muse, as with the Gwen John and Rodin example, often completely erase not only that many of these women were artists themselves, but also that the muse as a concept, I mean, that in itself was not a kind of passive thing. Like to be an artist model was a profession, and it was something that was incredibly creative and active in its own right. I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's troubling because I've recently done a display at the Fitzwilliam Museum, which is about art by women and representations of women in the 20th century. And the title of it is Women Makers and Muses. And I think that's partly because this idea of the muse is such it's a readily available idea that everyone kind of understands. But it is annoying and stressful as well. And it's something that I know lots of women artists, including Celia Paul, who came to see the display, she hates the word muse, as she rightly should, because it's a word that has, haunted her as much as it's haunted so many other women of incredible talent. So yeah, I feel ambivalent about muse. So basically is my answer to your question.
That's completely fair. One of the ways that you kind of subvert that relationship, though, between these kind of, as you say, these sort of supposedly genius male artists and the women in their lives, is to talk a lot about the relationships between women, and to really foreground those and give them the time that they are so often not given. And so many of your subjects are either queer or have had queer relationships, in to varying kind of degrees of importance in their lives. And I was wondering about the relationship between queerness and still life, and thinking about, sort of still life as this domestic scene, and what relationship you feel that has to these kind of queer artists.
Rosa, I want to know your answer to this question.
No, you don't.
And they don't.
I think that's a really, really interesting question. And it's something that I mean, because I think that perhaps the relationship that I'm trying to draw out is that if you are a queer person, you're already having to remake all of your sort of social coordinates, and you're having to constantly rethink and reconstitute what it is to have a life and to be close to other people and to make a home. And so that kind of heightened attention to the everyday and the domestic, you can feel that, I think, in the kind of still life that queer people make. That, I hope, is the argument of the book.
I mean, definitely. And in many ways, I'm asking you a very leading question because the answer is in the book, you guys. But your treatment of still life as a genre is very broad in this book. Did you have a kind of working definition as you were going through? Did it expand? Did it contract? What was your relationship with that genre?
I mean, I think it is a very loose use of the term, I would say, because I include interiors as well, which are kind of, sort of not as small. They're kind of zoomed out still life. But I think that was important because I think that really what I wanted to explore were scenes of domesticity. I wanted to be inside the home. I wanted them to be interiors. And I think that part of the reason why still life is such a kind of understudied and undervalued genre is that because we have these overly specific ideas about what it should be. And I think that when people think of still life, I think you tend to think of these incredibly, the kind of opulent, spectacular, airless sort of Renaissance images. And I think that partly in the book, what I wanted to do is to kind of think about more broadly what it means to paint the everyday, which I think is kind of my broad definition of what still life is.
No, I mean, that absolutely comes through. And there's this real sense of the way in which you're treating, still life in almost quite literal terms. You have this sense of like, well, there is stillness here and there is some kind of life being gestured towards in a kind of broader way. And interestingly, I think that is also the way that you write personally. Like you're very good at drawing out these kind of small details of often listing or collating the small details in order to kind of gesture towards something much larger, rather than doing a kind of, again, I suppose that traditional art criticism thing of being like, and here is, you know, the way in which we should read all of this, and this is, and instead you kind of present it and then sort of step back slightly. I suppose the question at the end of that is, was that deliberate?
Yes. Super. Thank you, Rosa. That was such a lovely reading of my work. I was so welcome. Just trained papers. Thought that would be a longer answer. Sorry.
One of the other things I was thinking about in terms of your writing style is that you seem very intent in some ways on the idea of the happy ending. I think you have an incredibly optimistic, interpretive perspective. Do you think, was that a sort of deliberate methodological strategy, or is it just because you're a cheery kind of gal?
Well, I am a cheery kind of gal, as you know, Rosa, but it was a deliberate methodological decision because my work is very, very influenced by the work of Eve Sedgwick and her ideas about reparative reading, which I think is another way of saying a kind of happy ending, where it's like trying to think about ways to recover work that perhaps has kind of anxiety attached to it, basically. And I think I wanted to look at, for instance, someone like Carrington, who, and Gwen John as well, these women whose stories come freighted with so much sadness and angst and despair, I think, in the way that they're normally told. And Carrington in particular, you know, it's very difficult to find an article online about her that doesn't begin with something about her suicide. And I just think this is such a horribly reductive way of thinking about a life like that. And so, yeah, it was a deliberate decision to draw out the happiness of this work. I think also because, as I mentioned in the chapter on Ethel Sands, I think there is this tendency to think about queer life in the past as being just unending despair and disappointment and longing and frustration. And I think that actually for some of the women in this book, that actually isn't how it was, or they made creative use of what they had and then through their own ingenuity managed to make their own happiness. And I think that's something that I really wanted to highlight, the kind of skill and the perseverance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sense of it being, again, subversive, to imagine, as you say, these, you know, often at one point, Becky actually imagines a kind of alternative life ending. And that's very, I mean, that's very opposed to sort of, I don't know, academic writing or whatever, to use that imaginative or creative kind of tool to say, what else can we think about this person? How can we kind of approach that? Did you feel when you were writing this that this was an academic text or a creative text? Or, I mean, obviously the answer is, it's both. But like, to what extent were you kind of thinking about ideas of, I don't know, being cited or thinking through those kind of establishment ideas?
I mean, as I said, I was writing it at the same time as my PhD and really, really struggling with what the PhD was demanding that I do, you know, write all of this turgid academic prose. And I think that the book was the kind of direct consequence of me feeling like I wanted to write something more playful and weirder than academic writing would normally allow. And even as you say, with something like ending the Carrington chapter with this like speculative fantasy about an alternative life for her, which is both very unacademic and also not very biographical, but felt to me like it was very responsive to Carrington herself, as I had come to understand her through a real deep immersion in her letters, where she had said in her letters that she doesn't like biographies, that she much prefers fantasy. And so I wanted to be directly responsive to her, which I think is something that, again, academia doesn't really encourage you to do, perhaps. So as you said, the answer is both. I mean, there is obviously some academic language in it, and it is shaped by academic reading, but I like to think that stylistically it departs from everything that I find very boring about academia.
It does, in the sense that it is not at all boring. I mean, it's really not. It's this incredibly kind of immersive read. You know, you're kind of carried along by it so much. So how much did you worry about, and this is something I'm asking as a kind of non-art critic, a non-art historian, I was interested in the idea of, I suppose, for want of a better term, teleology, not to be academic about it, but thinking about that idea of the kind of the object either in the archive or on the gallery wall, and sort of working backwards from it, imagining the process of creating it, for example, imagining the process of the things that would have to be in place in order for this work to be created. Did you kind of worry about that? Did you think about that process of kind of reading backwards, or occasionally reading forwards as well?
If your question is about intention and about how the artwork was made,
It can be.
yeah. Yes, I mean, I did think about that a lot. And I think that, again, having worked in museums for most of my career, I think that I have been encouraged to think about that, you know, all the time when I'm reading work. And I wanted to sort of move away from that slightly, just because I think that these ideas about the kind of the production, the kind of minutiae of how something is made, is not necessarily the most interesting thing about a piece of work, perhaps. And it's also something that I guess we can never know that much about it, maybe. I mean, there are loads of really interesting things about the ways in which the women in this book made their work. I mean, Gwen John worked in her studio, which was her own tiny Paris room, and that's why all of her work is so small. She never made anything larger than, you know, something that could fit on her wall and some things that could be stored. And again, those kind of material conditions massively shaped. Again, that's why someone like Vanessa Bell was so prolific, is that she had enough room to store all of this work. Although nevertheless, when I was working through the archive, one of the most kind of amazing things about it was that I got to see what I would describe as the sort of B-sides, but maybe even worse than that, more like D-sides. I think paintings that Vanessa Bell just abandoned and put in a box, and I think never imagined that anyone would ever see. And some of them are gloriously bad. And I think there's something kind of amazing about that. Seeing an artist like her who has some works that are just, you know, dazzlingly brilliant, seeing them make these really kind of awkward, strange, not very good mistakes, basically, and then trying to kind of conceal the evidence, but not doing so much. What I found quite touching was that she didn't destroy these works, that they were all still there. And yeah, which I just think is so cool.
I really love that, because at one point you actually do talk about someone's, I think it is actually Vanessa Bell, this sense of badness. And that was really revolutionary to me, because as someone who also works on, you know, marginalized, overlooked women writers, I'm constantly trying to be like, God, they were so brilliant, really, like, you should read them and they're really important. And, you know, and being kind of obsessed with that idea of proving their worth. And I thought it was kind of incredible and revolutionary that you were like, this sucks. And that's okay. She's allowed to be bad as well as brilliant.
Totally. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, is how some of Vanessa Bell's work is really bad. But I think that that's what's really interesting about it. And some of the work is kind of laughably strange. It's just really, really bizarre. And I think what's so great about bad work by an artist is that bad work has this kind of anonymity to it, that it could be basically done by anyone. Like some of the bad painting that I'm talking about in the book looks like something that could be done by a kind of amateur that you would pick up in a car boot sale or something. And I think there's something so remarkable about that. Again, when you're thinking about an artist who's created things that, you know, changed the course of English modernism, that they also did these sort of rubbish paintings that nevertheless they went on to exhibit and sell in that case. And I just think there's something, you know, you're seeing someone's real vulnerabilities there, where, you know, they're kind of overreaching, and I like
again,
that.
it's that sense of the minor that you were talking about, like, you know, that even within this, you know, this sense of existing on the margins of this kind of tremendous canon, that even then there are also minor works within that minority.
Yeah, I hadn't even connected that, but of course, enjoying badness is also about enjoying the minor.
A form of the minor. Yeah. one of the things you occasionally provide, often in the absence of other work to draw on, is that you occasionally provide readings of paintings of these women, as in taking them as their subjects, not just by these women. What did that kind of bring to the process of, in particular, biography?
I think that it was about, for instance, there are certain artists whom you can't see that clearly because the way that they present themselves in their letters is very stylized, or it's very evasive, or it's very self-conscious and performative. And it just interested me to think about how other people saw them and how other people's own processes of mythologizing kind of affected that. So with someone like Carrington, the portrait of her by Mark Gertler that I write about, it is this kind of amazing, I mean, it's a beautiful painting, but it doesn't really match Carrington as a person at all. And it shows something so interesting about their relationship, about his kind of total misunderstanding of her as a person. And so that really fascinated me. And the other instance in which I do that, I think, is with Gwen John and Mary Catherine Constance Lloyd. And I wanted to include that painting actually in particular because Mary Catherine Constance Lloyd, who I do a very short section on in this book, there are only like 2 or 3 of her works that survive. And I really wanted to get that into the book. And also because I think that in the absence of letters, paintings can be a source of showing relationships and intimacies and things like that.
It's interesting that you're thinking about those ideas of the interactions between art objects and written objects, things like letters. And you often actually do, kind of delve back into your like literary roots and kind of provide readings of letters or of fragments of what could be called, poetry or something akin to it that you have found in the archives. To what extent do you think those kind of forms, art and writing, are sort of continuous for a lot of your subjects?
I think that they were very continuous. For Carrington and for Gwen John in particular, Carrington's letters, I really recommend that everyone should read them. They're absolutely hilarious. She's so kind of playful and strange and silly, and the letters themselves are both kind of written objects and visual objects. They're full of these really beautiful doodles, and they're just, I think that she really was a writer as well, although I don't think she would have thought of herself in those terms. And similarly, Gwen John, the written and the visual were incredibly connected. I mean, the archival material of hers is just, incredible. And it's full of, completely impenetrable pencil that crosses between English and French, that is sort of overlaid with sketches for things. And so she really thought about things, I think, in both of those mediums.
And you were talking earlier about Ethel Sand's like letters, and the ways in which they're written in this sort of crosshatch kind of style. Could you talk a bit about that? Kind of describe the exact.
So the letters are written, they're cross-written, which was a method for keeping letters private. So you kind of write sequentially as you would, and then you turn the page around and you write again in the same way. So you get this kind of lattice effect. It really works because you really can't, it was incredibly difficult for me to read anything. And in the book, I actually transcribed some of the notes that I made in the archive, which was me picking out about 10 words in one letter, which give off this kind of incredibly lyrical, jumbled, quite beautiful, quite sort of poetic in a way, text. There's something so amazing about something like that, because obviously it was impossible for me to read, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens, and there must be hundreds of them. And it just amazed me to think that Ethel Sands and her partner, Nan Hudson, that this language must have been comprehensible to them. Like this must have been, and the kind of training and time and perseverance that must have taken them both to establish this kind of coded language that they both knew what they were saying. I just think that that's incredible.
No, absolutely. And there's that real sense of, again, the materiality of the archive in that, you're kind of, again, that's one of the moments in which there's a kind of a sense in which you emerge because you have to say, these are impenetrable. Like, I have no idea how to kind of deal with
absolutely.
this.
And what was funny was that night I went to see one of my very dear friends, and we went to a bar in Stoke Newington, and I was sort of showing her these images on my phone and saying, what does this look like to you? And then we were sort of attracting the attention of other people in the bar. And I was asking everyone, what does this look like to you? And no one had any idea. But I was trying to crowdsource some information, but it's just, yeah.
I mean, it is an incredible moment. And there are, you know, some photographs in the book. And I should say as well that this book is composed of text and images. And so you really get that kind of interaction where you as the reader are also trying to pass what is going on. And you're like, nope, fair enough. Yeah, can't read that at all. So listen, it's probably time for some audience questions. Yes. Does anyone have one kind of burning? If not, then I can keep talking. Sam, would you like to proffer a question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just before Becky answers, I'm aware that we have online viewers who won't have been able to hear you, so I'm just going to relay that question. Sam says, you have these kind of captions underneath. As I mentioned, there are, you know, photographs and kind of images throughout the text. And you have underneath what Sam describes as sort of elliptical captions underneath. Could you talk a bit about them?
Yeah, so I think that was born out of I think it relates to my exhaustion with and desire to reinvent the label, the museum label, and just finding often the kind of descriptive or basically kind of tautological nature of labels very boring. And it struck me that I didn't necessarily want to have a kind of full identification line underneath every single image. I wanted, in some ways, the images to be more integrated into the text itself, to have these kind of references to what the text was doing. And so often the captions are snippets. I think they're almost all snippets from the text itself. So it's kind of connecting the image to a particular line in the book, rather than having them kind of free floating. Because I did, as you say, like, I think that it was really, really important to me to have the images interspersed, rather than originally when the book was proposed, it was going to be color plates in the middle, which I'm just so happy that is not how it is, because I think that interplay, as we were saying, it was important to the artists that I'm talking about, and so therefore I wanted to kind of replicate that in the text itself. If that answers your question, Sam. Yeah, exactly.
He says it does. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes, Ilva.
Oh,
Ilva asks, can Becky talk about the title of the book?
that is a great question, Ilva. Thank you.
A beautiful title, she said.
As I'm sure you
Sorry
know,
that I'm doing this like transcription thing.
As I'm sure most people here know, including you, Rosa, I agonized over the title. Choosing a title for a book is so difficult. And I think it's incredibly difficult when you're writing about so many different subjects that themselves are very different to each other. And I mean, I'm sure I sent you some really not very happy messages about various different titles, and
every possible title was brilliant.
Exactly.
In its own way,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah, my brother, who's in the audience, suggested about 50 alternative titles to me. So everyone was really in on the project of trying to find me a title for the book. I think the problem was that although Carrington and Gwen John in particular had these very compelling, beautiful letters, none of it was quite right. I wanted to have something from them as the title. But Gwen John's letters are so intense that it didn't feel like it was quite right. And I couldn't find anything in Carrington. So I ended up doing this very strange process of just reading very slowly Virginia Woolf's essays in order to try and come across some kind of resonant praise. And
we're not supposed to admit stuff like
really, that is what I'm telling the truth here, everyone. But when I actually came across this particular essay, which is a slightly obscure essay of Virginia Woolf's, this dark country, which is, a phrase that Virginia Woolf used to describe women's lives before women began writing about them in fiction, that there were this sort of vast territory of possibilities and desires and everyday practices that just nobody was talking about, that it was just completely enveloped in shadow. And I thought that that actually was a very strikingly visual image of something that I was trying to do as well. It was a kind of shared pursuit. I think that she was interested in fiction writers who were trying to describe this dark country for the first time. And I think there's something very similar was going on in visual art, which is which is why it became the title. But I
well, it's why, I mean, it gestures towards that very visual chiaroscuro thing. Exactly. of and actually similarly to my experience of you emerging from the text and from the gloom, from this dark country appears this light. Any other questions? Yes, Camilla. Okay, so Camilla is asking, sorry everyone that's actually here, about on a sentence level, the book is incredibly beautiful, and thinking of Virginia Woolf, who are some of your other writing influences?
Gosh, there are just so many, Camilla. That's such a good question. I mean, I think that Virginia Woolf has been a huge and lasting influence on my work. In nonfiction, I love Maggie Nelson's book on art, The Art of Cruelty. Obviously, I was kind of, I've gone through all of Olivia Lang's work. I also really love, I think it actually wasn't published in the UK, but Lisa Cohen, her book, All We Know, which is a biography of 3 women, which is incredibly lyrical and just gorgeous. And I mean, there's just so much stuff. Now I'm kind of drawing a blank, but I read loads of fiction, basically. I think that I wanted to write nonfiction in a way that resonated with people that read fiction. And so that is kind of, and poetry as well. So that is sort of stylistically where I was going. I mean, I don't actually read that much biography, which might be obvious from the kind of biography that I've written. But yeah.
We don't want to be tainted by that stuff.
Sorry, that wasn't a very complete answer, Camilla. I'll tell you more later.
We've possibly got time for just maybe one very quick question. Oh, this is terrible because I've known everyone's names so far and I'm afraid I don't know yours. Hi, Kitty.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, I bet. Well, I really think that we should both propose this. Oh, sorry, Rosa. I was getting so absorbed in Kitty's question. Just really quickly, Kitty is asking. Oh no, Kitty hasn't finished.
Okay, so the 2-parter question is, Kitty is saying it's kind of amazing that Becky hasn't put online especially Ethel Sands's cross-hatched letters, thinking about that as a sort of methodological strategy, and the way in which that interacts with the fact that it's sort of great that she hasn't, because it lets itself percolate. I didn't put it as well as Kitty did. But Becky, you want to take over?
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, I think that for me, I wanted to be attentive throughout to what, for instance, what those women wanted me to see and what they really didn't want me to see and what they didn't want to be revealed. Like, I hate the idea of this kind of biography or that's kind of omniscient or kind of knowing, that's trying to kind of reveal, things that particular figure would never have wanted revealed. I think that there's something quite cruel and not very empathetic about something like that. And so at the same time, I wanted to retain somewhat the kind of mysteriousness of those letters, because I think that is an important part of the reticence that defined Ethel Sands' identity and her aesthetic. As for, I think that the tape should really put those things, they should digitize that, because I'm sure that if they digitize them, there would be someone out there, as you say, who has much better eyesight than me, and he would be able to decode what was going on there.
Okay, so with the aim of retaining some of your mystery, we're going to wrap up there. Did you like that? So good.
That was great, Rosie. Worked hard on it.
Okay, so Becky will be signing books over at a small, sort of slightly precarious looking signing table over there. If you could, in the efforts of COVID safety, either wear a mask or retain some kind of distance from the auteur, that would be much appreciated. Whom I love to embarrass. And thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Murray and Lighthouse for having us. And thank you so much to the wonderful Rebecca Benton.